Hi, third grade. It's time for Soldier Dogs. Chapter 31. Chief, Matt bellowed. Fetch! Chief heard more than fear in Matt's voice. He heard anger. His hackles raised, and he stood guard between Matt and Rachel. Where was the threat? The humans yapped uselessly at each other, while Matt and Rachel flailed their arms. Chief pricked his ears and there, footsteps. Running away. Fleeing fast between buildings and leaving a strange scent trail. The smell of river water and engine oil and something else. Violence and Matt. The man had Matt's scent on him. A growl of fury rumbled in Chief's throat. He flashed forward. Landry wasn't stupid. He released the leash and followed Chief. Chief's legs blurred, his muzzle lifted in a snarl. His ears pinpointed the fleeing man, and he chased him through the smoke and the rubble. His heart pounded with the hunt. Landry and the other men followed, blocks behind. The prey's scent changed. The man was afraid. Good. The man scrambled into a wide open space with a hard floor. He spun around to face Chief, and a long metal tooth, a knife, grew from one of his hands. It was sharper than any dog's tooth. The man crouched, raising the metal tooth that was a knife. A distant part of Chief's mind told him to wait for his pack. Wait for the men. Circle the prey man and wait. But a bigger part still smelled Matt's anger. Chief didn't hesitate. He didn't break his stride. He flattened his ears and he bared his teeth and he ran directly at the man. He leaped for his throat. The metal tooth, the knife, bit into Chief's side. He felt the burn of a wound, but he didn't yelp or cringe. Instead, he slammed the man backwards. The man fell with a grunt, cracking his head on the ground. Chief rolled and stood a bit. The man's arm, the one holding with the metal tooth. I'm going to reread that. Chief rolled and stood and bit the man's arm, the one holding the metal tooth, the knife. He shook his head like breaking a prey animal's neck, and the tooth, the knife, flew. It clattered against the ground in the shadows. Chief's side still burned, but he didn't care. He bunched his legs for another leap. Please, the man dragged himself away from Chief. Call him off! Call him off! Chief! Landry ran into the open space. Down! Down, Chief! Chief stalked the man, ignoring Landry's yipping. Call your dog off, the prey man wept. Please, bitte nicht. Speaking German. Chief didn't understand the yipping, but he approved of the sudden hardness in Landry's posture, the sudden wolfishness. The prey man was an enemy. It is true, the man yipped. I surrender. The boy is right. I am a Luftwaffe bombardier. A German, a Nazi soldier. Well, Mr. Bombardier, Landry said, his voice smooth with threat, if I were you, I'd keep very still. The prey man went motionless, except for his frightened panting. Chief bared his teeth and eyed the man's throat. Blood soaked the fur on Chief's side. He ignored the weakness in his left leg and watched the man, looking for any sign of defiance or fighting back. Chief began to feel woozy, but he stayed watchful. He was ready to pounce. But the prey man did not move. not until the rest of Landry's pack came. As Chief's leg started trembling, they dragged the prey man to his feet and shoved him away. Boy, you really are a doozy, Landry told Chief. Why, I'd say you're the cat's meow, but I don't want to insult you. And then Chief flopped to the ground. He was exhausted from the long night and the wound, the slash on his side. You're bleeding, Landry sat beside Chief, looking at his cut. Why, you've been hurt. Chief rested his head on Landry's leg. Darkness came. Should I read another chapter? Okay, chapter 32. Now it's June 19th, 1942, and it is 2 o'clock in the afternoon. For days after the raid, smoke hung in the air above Canterbury, smelling to Matt like melted rubber and charred wood. 800 buildings lay in ruins, and over 5,000 more were damaged. Almost 50 people had died that night. But the steeple of the Canterbury Cathedral still rose above the smoke and haze. The Nazis had wanted to destroy the cathedral. They'd wanted to break the spirit of the enemy. But they had failed. Hundreds of fire trucks had gathered to fight the flames during and after the raids. Civilians and soldiers banded together to help each other while fire watchers patrolling the roofs and gutters threw incendiary bombs down to safety. Incendiary bombs are the ones that catch fire. The cathedral still stood tall, though it bore the scars of the attack. Shattered windows, a crumbling wall, scorched lawns. Farther down the hill, Matt crept along the hallway in his house. Stealthy, silent, and he was feeling a little sad. He paused outside the kitchen door and listened. He made a face when he heard the murmuring inside. He took a breath for courage. Then he turned the knob very slowly. If Chief had been around, he would have noticed Matt. His ears would have pricked up and his tail would have thumped a few times. But as it was, nobody saw Matt open the door an inch and peer inside. His mom sat with Mrs. Lloyd at the table. And the newborn baby, the noisy, red-faced infant, slept in Mrs. Lloyd's arms. Actually sleeping for once. The baby screamed so loudly at night that Matt heard her from the next door. He called her the siren. But Rachel, for some reason, found the baby adorable. She was standing next to Mrs. Lloyd right now, gazing at the little monster with misty eyes. Psst, Matt said, staying quiet so he wouldn't risk waking up the siren. Yes, Matt, his mother said in her regular voice. Shh, don't wake her. Matt looked to Rachel and whispered, Are you coming? Rachel touched the baby's swaddled foot. It was wrapped for warmth. Is it already time? Shh, yeah, come on. Okay, Rachel followed him into the hallway. You're always wanting me to tag along. Oh, very funny, said Matt. Every time I turn around, there you are, she said, like a shadow. Oh, shake a leg already, Matt said. She giggled and followed him outside. They tromped through the streets, keeping away from the ruined ones, toward the park. When they got there, they found Private Landry throwing a stick for Chief. Chief flashed between the trees, moving smooth and strong. His coat was glossy, despite the shaved patch where a veterinarian had stitched his cut. He didn't seem to notice Matt and Rachel, except one of his ears swiveled toward them before he pounced on the stick. Matt smiled. He liked knowing that Chief knew he was there, that Chief always kept track of him. Rachel, Matt, Private Landry called. I can't believe how fast Chief has recovered. You've taken really good care of him. That's nothing. Matt looked to Rachel. Are you ready? She nodded and told Private Landry. Count to 100, then tell Chief to find. Private Landry gaped at Rachel and Matt. You've been training him? 1, Matt said, jogging toward the other end of the park. 2. Rachel ran beside him. 3. They scrambled around a vegetable garden and through a thicket, then veered onto a path. 35. 36. The path curved toward the river, which smelled of geese and pond. 57, 58, 59. Matt stopped beneath a tree and interwove his fingers. Rachel put one foot in his hands, and he boosted her onto a thick branch. 85, she whispered, as Matt clambered beside her. 86. They counted the rest silently. Hiding in the tree, quiet and still. In the distance, Landry shouted, Chief, find! Matt held his breath. He and Rachel had trained Chief every day since the vet said he could run. And every day, Chief found the person hiding almost immediately. Then he'd look at them like they were stupid for getting lost again. Except they'd never tried this with anyone else, saying, find. What if Chief didn't understand Landry? What if... But just then, paws rustled through fallen leaves and a sharp bark sounded. Chief's bright eyes watched them. Matt imagined him thinking, how did you get lost up in a tree, you silly humans? Chief barked again. I'm coming, Landry called from farther in the park. Matt? Rachel put her hand on Matt's arm. Are you sure about this? Yeah. He swallowed a lump in his throat. It's what Eric would want. Yes, but do you want? What do you want, Matt? Matt felt tears in his eyes. I understand now. I know why my parents let Eric enlist. There are things you can't ignore, battles you can't run from. Sometimes you have to fight. Sometimes you have to give everything you've got. And Chief barked. Chief's not a pet. He's a soldier. Matt looked down. He's a soldier dog. When Landry jogged into sight, Matt dropped from the tree. Then he fell to his knees. He felt tears on his cheeks as he spread his arms to Chief. Chief knew how he felt. Chief always knew. He stepped forward into Matt's hug, and he rubbed his head against Matt's chin. His fur was warm and soft. Matt heard Rachel and Landry talking to each other, but he just held Chief and cried. After what felt like a long time, he kissed Chief's head and stood up. Wiping the tears from his eyes, he reached into his shirt and pulled out the clump of cloth that he had stuffed there. This is for Chief, he said, giving it to Landry. It's my pillowcase. So wherever he goes, it'll always smell like home. Matt knew he'd cry when Chief left to join Dogs for Defense, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. For him, for Chief, for Eric. He felt bad about saying goodbye, and at the same time he felt good about his decision. He kept sniffling, though, and he didn't even mind when Rachel took his hand. He didn't have Chief anymore, but he wasn't alone. Matt and Rachel walked home in silence until 3 doors down from their house when they heard a shriek. There goes the siren again, Matt grumped. Except it wasn't the baby crying with hunger or a wet diaper. It was his mother screaming with joy. She burst from the front door waving a telegram and shouted, They found him! They found Eric! He's okay! He's alive! Relief and joy exploded in Matt's heart, brighter than any bomb. He whooped and hugged Rachel. When he spun her in circles, Her braid flapped wildly, and her laughter rang out. The Canterbury air didn't stink of melted rubber and charred wood to Matt. Not any more. Now it smelled of hope.